and welcome back to Open Your Eyes. Joining us now is Mr. Fermin Olivera, who is a social worker and the former executive director of the Community Rehabilitation Department. Good morning, Fermin.
Yes, good morning, good morning. Just a little, well, two things. I don't know what you all do to be bouncy so early in the morning, but yeah, I was the former director of the community rehab. At some point, I did that for a number of years. And of course, the counseling center fell under that department, the youth hostel fell under that department. And there was a big move at the time for community-based interventions, what to do with kids, preferably outside of institutional care, to bring maybe some levels of rehabilitation in their lives. So, yeah. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about children who are in conflict in the law. So maybe we can start by breaking down, which children we're talking about there.
Okay. Well, in a nutshell, these children are those that maybe have committed some offenses. So they're in conflict with the law, and there is a little population that has been if they're considered uncontrollable, then they can also fall into that scope of that work. The kids that are beyond parental control, they can enter into that kind of system, the system that deals with kids in conflict with the law. So yes, so you can think about these persons, and I think people sometimes do. These are young offenders, so to speak. But not every young person in institutional care is a young offender. Some of them are just have behavioral problems. Yeah.
So there's a differentiation between where children are placed, right? You have the hostel, we have Wagner's. Well, talk to me about these systems and who they are supposed to serve.
Well, to the best of my understanding, knowing that I have been out of that formal setting for many years. I mean, it's in excess of, I think, about 10 years now. But there was a need, let me put it this way, Marlene, there was a need to develop a kind of a continuum of care where from a least restrictive to a maybe more restrictive depending on the needs of young persons, including maybe places for young persons with mental situations that are maybe not all there. So the youth hostel was the kind of a setting where a number of groups could go. People that were on remand, meaning young persons who are awaiting trial or some kind of a thing, they would be placed there, along with people who have been sentenced to be there, kind of placed there for rehabilitation purposes. Of course, males and females could go there. And then I think the Wagner's Youth Facility came on stream at some point as also services for persons who were not in conflict but maybe high risk. Now that needs to be verified, and I must tell you there are persons who are maybe more knowledgeable about the actual setting today. But that was supposed to be the function for the youth. Is it the youth cadet, right?
Yes, there's also the cadet.
The cadet, yeah. That could come for services for periodic times. It's kind of residential living. You go home on weekends, those kinds of things. Yes.
Yeah. I think it's important because I think we don't pay attention as much to these institutions until an issue comes to the surface. So we don't think of the children at hostel. In fact, we very rarely think of them as children until there's a major issue that arises. But it is critical to understand from people like you who've worked in the system, just what happens in a child's life that leads them to be in an institution like the hostel or like Wagner's or in conflict with the law.
Well, this is no secret, Marlene. The history underpinning those young persons, those children that enter these institutions, including other institutions like child care, which is a completely different institution. It's abuse and neglect. At the heart of that is child abuse and neglect issues. It's the kind of mechanism that has served them to hurt them. So after a history of abuse and neglect, doing poorly in school, and all the things that accompany these persons, they end up in institutional care because they have committed some kind of offense or are beyond parental control. So that's their history. I always thought about this as, it's when we fail in catching kids early, we end up punishing them later. And even at the time when I was there, it happened selectively in extreme cases, and most regrettably, you had people navigating through all of these systems and ending up ultimately at prison facilities. That's, maybe it wasn't something publicly known, but it happened in rare instances. I suspect that those kinds of things might still be happening, and really they should not.
Yeah.
You hear if your behavior is can't be managed at the youth hostel, for example, then you will kind of graduate into those things. I don't want to say much about that, except that those things need to be checked. And it's not up to the institution to do that. There must be other players in the system that have some level of responsibility or interest or care to check these systems that it works. Without checks, it falls into the hole,
Yeah.
Well, I think also what you say sort of begs a question of, abuse and neglect being the root causes of these things. When the children do end up in these facilities, I think the question on everybody's mind is what is the type of care, what sort of resources are being used, what access do they have to things like therapy, counseling, what have you, in order to improve the problem that exists.
I imagine that you have those, but those are for the people that are there to say that. What I can tell you is that needs to be the biggest aspect, the programs. I think when we think about development or so, you think infrastructure and so on, those are great, but when you're talking about people rehabilitation, along with infrastructure, conveniences, buildings, rooms, that kind of thing, you need programs, which requires skilled people to come in, which requires, and I don't want to, I'm just being critical here, high energy people to come in. So you need to have maybe younger person without kind of getting into ageism, but you can't really have, and maybe we have a history of this, of grandparents raising young kids. It's not a good formula. They can be a part of, but they can't be that major, because they just do not have the energy. So you need the kind of people to be working at these facilities. And of course, hopefully you're thinking that they're well trained and stuff like that. But so it's a combination of the human factor and the systemic factor. How many do we need? I can tell you, you need so many people to work so many workers to be able to manage and address so many bodies there. In institutional settings, that becomes a dance that you have to do, because you want your best and most persons when everybody is at the institution. And this fluctuates. Mostly on the weekends, that's when you want programs, and when you want activities, that's when you want all the things to keep these young persons occupied as best as possible.
We naturally, we're very compassionate about the issues that children face, with the exception of when they come in contact with the law. If we think of perpetrators of gun violence as a classic example, the juvenile justice reform, looking at the protections that are in place for them, even from restricting their name and faces and being made public. Those are things that people have been extremely critical about. But I guess my question really leads me to the fact that the public wants accountability from children who come in conflict with the law. But is it that we are missing the boat, that we need to find more interventions to be put in place, that we don't end up in that scenario?
Well, of course, Marilyn, I think, I know that there has been a shift in how we see kids. And yes, we have come a long ways. We have lots of technology, many advances in knowledge, many advances in understanding human behavior. And so we have moved from that punitive way of doing certain things. That is not, let me say this, rehabilitation is a tough job, you know. It's a tough thing to do.
Yeah.
If I think about it in social work or in the military, that's like the special forces of social work. To do rehabilitation work with these kids. Let's just put it right out there. You know, it's very difficult to do. And we have, because we know that it's oppression and duress and a history of abuse and neglect, that is what needs to change. And the adults must have the responsibility. I think we pay more care at image instead of results. And when it comes to institutional care, and I kind of hear it, it's the image. Well, the image is reflected based on what happens, on the reactions. And you know, yes, maybe we are aware of the big things that happen, but then that's a reflection of something else. And we must hold adults responsible for that. It's the state. And you know, this is not like a family. Yes, families have responsibility, but it takes another layer. When you put a child in state care and something goes wrong, people need to be outraged, especially if the answers are not forthcoming. I think that's something that, at least to my mind, you know, hasn't been handled satisfactorily, you know.
Then we only have anecdotal information about these things. And so we have been told repeatedly that a part of the reason why we see younger children being involved in criminal activity, specifically young men, is capitalizing on the very protection systems that have been put in place for them. In other words, I will recruit a 16 or 17-year-old to be able to execute a crime on my behalf for the very reason that, you know, if he goes to jail, there's a lot more sensitivity in handling that particular case.
Well, to suggest that, what we call that in social work language, blaming the victims. You look at the situation and you blame them. Oh, you have so much liberties or so much rights or so. Well, that's the way to go. It's a rights-based movement. Actually, the contrary has been what has hurt us. So to suggest that, you know, maybe, you know,
that we're protecting children too much,
protecting them too much is just completely ridiculous. To let me say that, you know, what we call maybe protecting kids, you know, or the absence of protecting, or how do you correct behaviors? People, don't get me wrong. Lots of people are still doing great things with their kids in rearing great, fantastic children out there, irrespective of how they might look, or, you know, people are raising great kids. You know, you watch what they do, and this is how you come to some kinds of conclusion. You watch at the histories of children that enter institutions, and so you will see actually gross neglect, abuse. That is what has hurt them. The more of that we have, the more we'll see kids needing or going into these.
Let me dive into, because I know the commissioner most recently spoke of the issue of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and he's expressed that children are not being taught responsibilities along with these rights. Now, we're approaching the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Belize is one of the it's like the 5th signatory to this convention, looking at special protection mechanisms. There are only 3 countries in the entire world that have not signed on to this convention. And so we have implemented quite a bit in being able to have the proper protections and ensuring that children can reach their full potential. But yet we seem to be regressing to a time where people say, oh, well, children have too many rights and now parents have less rights, and that's why we have the situation today.
Well, yeah,
I want you to respond to that.
Yeah, well, let me say this. It's not the rights to children that is problematic. Actually, I am convinced that is not the case. And I'm just baffled even by the question. You know, so it's difficult. Let me share this because I'm thinking about it. we need to wake up to a reality that the idea of the rights of children is not just jargon, is not just language.
Yep.
The rights of children should be action-based. And the least actions we do in this regard, then this is what we have. You see? And I'm saying this not to suggest that, okay, children need to, need to be punished. I mean, responsibilities. What are we talking about? When children go to institutional care, it's because they need specialized services. You don't go to a brain surgeon for rheumatism, to somebody who can cure. You go, that's specialized services. We need to stop blaming the victims and acknowledge that maybe we need to recheck and evaluate some of our responses. So the rights of the child is not just, it's more than an idea. Yeah. It's action-based. And I think of late, and I agree with you there, that of late, we are not even hearing that as a conversation. Because really we have little to account to show that is directional in the rights base of children. Yeah. The rights base of children cross-cuts our society. Yeah. And the kids at the youth hostel have no more or no less rights than every other child. Mm-hmm. So we need to stop playing the games of the language and instead really start to show that this is what we're upholding. And I think there is a lot to be desired when we think about it that way. It's not just talk, but it's about action. It's what are we doing. I think some of the biggest proponents to rights-based of children are pretty much mute. They're silent as of late, so.
Well, I think that also requires, I guess, just piggybacking off of your question, is that, it requires a whole change in mentality, right? Because, as you rightly said earlier, people think in terms of, they think in terms of punishment immediately, they think wrong punishment, especially children acting up, and then you hear comments like, send them to be there first, let them do something, or, or like what Marlene said, that children have too much rights. How then do we make that shift, in terms of educating people, that, it's more than just language, as you say?
Well, it's not how we do it. I think we need to hear from the authorities that have some responsibility to do this, instead of just some bureaucratic outfit that purports or should be doing this. They need to be out there. Rights-based shouldn't be cyclical. Rights-based must be continuous, on the ground, doing this, championing this. But really it boils down to an absence of checks, of balances, of calling people to account. And I think the minute that starts to happen, then rights-based, we can just, it's like smoke, it will just go away, But the real education is to hold those bodies accountable, to do what they need to be doing, and to call it what it is, because you're either doing it or not doing it.
No, you're a trained social worker, you are an educator, you're helping to educate the up-and-coming social workers as well, to really get into the field and work in some level of assisting in developing our community. When you say children who come in conflict with the law are victims, that's not something I think that people draw as a parallel very often. Mm-hmm. You see someone who comes in conflict with the law as a perpetrator, somebody who has broken the law, and if it's a crime against another person, then the other person is the victim. Mm-hmm. How do you bring these two ideas together?
Well, it's not easy to do, but it's sensitization, it's understanding. It's understanding that to make a person, a whole person, a functioning individual, it takes years, it takes investment, it takes many things happening. Now you have to understand about the power that a young person or a child might have in comparison to some older persons. So really the persons that fall victim to something going wrong in their lives is usually with the less powerful, which in many respects also we can think about that kind of like in poverty. You're very young, you're 2-3 years old, formative years, you have very little power to dictate what happens to you in your formative years. So we need to be sensitive to that and then hold including ourselves, those that probably have that power and control and authority to take care of, and we can see this in the sense of families. It's a revolving cycle, you know. It's a revolving cycle. Poor kids, these families, they end up growing up, they end up having their own kids. It becomes a revolving cycle. And somehow if you look at, well, this will never end. Well, I don't know if it will ever end, but we need to hold ourselves accountable for what is the role I am playing.
Yeah.
So in promoting social work education and really trying to put out the best workers out there. I am not worried about the education piece. I think the universities do a fair good job. I am worried about the climate in which these young professionals will go in and work. I think we have come, we're living in a time when they will be facing probably more institutional and systemic challenges more so than the client themselves. It's like you need to swim across this ocean, but you better have the strength alone. There's no life jacket, there's no little vessel to help you. It's an enormous job. So I think ultimately my main concern with young social workers getting in there is the climate that they'll have to navigate in. Yeah. I think it's one that it's pretty obscure, it's not very supportive, it's not very nurturing, and if you're not careful, the social work field quickly breaks you down as a human, as a person, because all you're seeing is human suffering and pain. Yeah. That's what you see and that's what you face. So,
and it's no secret. I mean, we've spoken to representatives from the human services, and they talk of the work that they do and the different levels of intervention that they have to make. And I think Belize is no different from many other places where we are seeing a large amount of caseload for an individual social worker, which really shouldn't be the case.
And it's not a secret. I mean, what do you do? For example, somebody has asked and repeatedly over, and I had the opportunity to work in this state. We can't compare ourselves to there in terms of caseload or those kinds of things. Yeah. It wouldn't work. But I think everybody will agree. Well, maybe there are a few persons that will not, that the burden, the caseloads are extremely high. Yeah. It's practically impossible to, when you hear some of these things, if the information is true, anytime you have a caseload of even 30 or 40, you are talking numbers, you're talking failure. That's what will happen. But at the end of that, who is failing? It's the very clients. It's the very people that we are supposed to serve. They fail, and it's not the worker, The worker might face another failure in terms of guilt and shame and all these things that we suffer when we're pushed to do things that maybe we can't do or shouldn't be doing, and you're crossing checks. But what's the end? In the end, fair enough. Certain different social workers can have different caseloads. Case management kind of things. You're looking at the highest, maybe 20, 25 cases. I don't know what is for real. What is the real number? But to do effective work, you must have manageable caseload. So, but that's they're the best ones to tell you that. But I can just see if the systems continue to push you in directions that you can't do it, then ultimately the end result will be simple. It's failure all around. Burnt out social workers, disillusioned, unhappy. If you are not waking up every day. A client
who doesn't get assistance, most importantly.
Of course.
And what, in your experience as a social worker, do you think makes maybe the biggest difference in terms of when you actually do intervene in, like, let's say a home that where there is abuse, where there is neglect, or for one of these children who actually does end up in the institution, what makes a difference so that there can be a positive outcome?
Maybe this is not a secret, but if it is, let me share it. It's relationships. The social worker must be the kind of natured person to be very confident in himself or herself, to be able to establish good, caring, helpful relationships. If that doesn't happen for whatever reasons, if I have my own issues and I can't, if I am maybe overly zealous, if I am overzealous of being respected, those kinds of things, you can't establish that relationship. It's relationships that will make the change. So you assuming and taking the responsibility as the adult, looking at the person. Like, for example, why should someone respect you? Why should a child in care respect you? Just because? No. These children have a history of abuse and neglect. Why should they respect anyone? Mm-hmm. It's up to you to use your skills and the knowledge that you have to make that connection. And then you will see change. You know, I had the great fortune or misfortune, whatever you can say, that I live with many of the people I work with. They were in my house. So there is, you can't be playing with the idea of social work. You live and breathe social work practice, because these are strangers coming in to live with you. Yeah. So social work was not just an academic idea. Yeah. You have to live that for it to work. Relationship still makes the biggest switch. You being able to link, to care, and that is where the connection happens. And then these people become available to be helped, because they will reject it, of course. They have been failed and they have been rejected and abused. Why should they trust anybody else?
It's such a complex problem, because, as I hear you speak, and I think, we have not talked very much about rehabilitation of children who do come in conflict with the law, and looking at the type of care that they're receiving. We know we get reports of people running away from hostel, and I think that's all par for the course, naturally, but also looking at what is actually taking place and how it's helping. But I can't help to think that perhaps all this focus on what the state is or maybe isn't providing is still removing one of the most critical roles, which is parents.
Of course, and I think that has been recognized a long time. What happens after, what happens during, what happens in
before.
The process of rehabilitation. Yeah, what happens before, and institutional care should be the last. I mean, anybody that knows anything about the rights of the child would know that the idea of putting children at the institution because of behavioral problems was something undesired, was something that they were thinking about.
It's like worst case scenario.
So, because really, let me just say this, if parents don't know this, this is no secret. If you place your child in any institutional care, the risk for things going bad for your child becomes very high. I don't care what institution it is. It's just a fact of what we know happens. It's way better if you're having a child with behavioral problems to maybe get the help at home in your community with the people that can to help you make that change. The minute people step into institutional care, the data is very clear around the world that things can go wrong for that child very quickly.
Yeah.
We need to be aware. So it's a last option resource. You don't just put them there. Mm-hmm. But Marlene, by no stretch, this is hard work. Yeah. This is hard work. My heart goes out to people that do this. Yeah. And people have to be accountable as well. It's hard work. They need to be supported. They need to have the tools to be able to do this. So many times when things go wrong, it's probably human error. But at least it's my guess that many things have gone wrong, and it's probably systemic error. It's the systems that have missed the ball, missed the game, But we don't know in the absence of maybe the coroner's inquest, which was, I think, ordered. I don't know if that was a joke or so. But did that happen? Mm-hmm. Or was it reported wrong? I think I read it in the newspaper or something. But if that was ordered to be done and it wasn't done, then it's a joke. It's a joke on all of us,
So, I feel that there has to be some sort of action that can be taken if we're talking about mitigating the situation where children even come in conflict with the law. We have the Human Services Department, the people who will go into homes, check in if there's a report made, or if they're aware of a situation where a child is not living in an ideal situation. But is it that we need to support parents more? When we hear, and like I say, I think people always go back to messages that we'd moved past, and so everybody starts saying, oh, it's because the village isn't involved in raising the child anymore. and I think they take it very literal, like your neighbor, your whole community. But is it a lack of support for parents? Is it a lack of parenting skills? Is it the outcome of people facing very serious poverty issues?
Well, it's complex. It's very dynamic. It's when you think about that, you start to wonder, well, where do we start to prevent this? Well, let me put it out there. We could never have a situation where there will be no need for children in institutional care. That's wishful thinking.
Okay.
For whatever reasons, let me coin this way, because we start to play with ideas of, yes, prevention is key. How many kids is acceptable to pass through an institution in a population of 380,000? What is an acceptable number? So we start from there, taking kind of a stock off. And then the ones that come in, what care are they receiving? Are they? It's numbers you're talking about. But yes, there is responsibility across parents. It's very rare that just knowingly a parent will want to hurt their kids. Now, there are cultural practices which it's intentional and purposeful, maybe because of not knowing or whatever. We do this. And the idea of lashing or these kinds of things, well, we know. And we try to retrain kids. Right now, there is a big idea of early childhood stimulation, children 0 to 3. Powerful. The data is coming out. And we can miss windows of opportunities.
Yeah.
And many times parents don't know this, So we're trying to do what we can. Yes, there is need for sensitization. Yes, it's parents that hurt their kids. They're setting up this. But many times it's not willful. Many times they just don't know. They just don't know or have the inability. So yes, there is responsibility throughout. But it still begs the question, what levels are tolerable or acceptable? And that those are kinds of the accounting that we have to start doing. I mean, how many people are living in poverty? Poor people do things that otherwise they probably wouldn't, But what level is acceptable for a little country like us, for a little economy like us?
Yeah.
I mean, where do we are? I mean, even with that figure, to be honest with you, people, you have all kinds of numbers, and the estimates that are there, it's estimates or so. I think in your show the other day, the people from the statistical, which is a great thing, that needed to be done, but it's being done finally.
Yeah.
That will provide some good information there. So Marlene, it's complex. I think you have to hold people accountable at the different points. If a parent is in need of support, then are they receiving the support, the quality, the caliber of the support to do that? So you take that. So if I have one parent that I'm working with or one family, then I should be able to be doing certain things. Some go through in terms of the children falling through, the people at the institution. You take stock of that as well. You can't blame the victims because maybe we have failed in certain areas. You have to take stock of what you're doing, when you're doing it, and where you're doing it. Do we need more response workers? Well, I can just guess. I would say maybe yes, given the numbers. Then who you hold responsible for that? Should I expect that you all should do much more double, triple work with less? Then who takes responsibility for that? So that becomes the accounting that you start to do. Yeah. Who is to be doing what? Because the minute you start to push people and the work and the hours and all of these things, that we're just human beings, we will crack. Mistakes happen and it costs us,
Now, how do you, in looking at the overall situation, and I appreciate what you're saying, that, parents have a role to play and perhaps are not willfully neglecting the children in any particular form. But the fact is that it does happen.
It does. It does.
And kind of the situational reasons, they go to school, they have behavioral problem, they're struggling getting through. Maybe they even have a learning challenge and they don't know.
Absolutely.
Can't make it through school, get to the mandatory 14, no longer progresses from there, starts to come in conflict with the law, or starts getting recruited by gangs, and it just snowballs. when that child who, when we saw them at 7 years old, thought, oh, poor baby, we wish there could be better for him. 10 years later, when that child becomes a perpetrator of a crime, we forget that 7-year-old that we had empathy for or sympathy for. How would you encourage people to still be able to see things through that light? And we have to be very real here, because so many people have been impacted by crime that it's even harder to imagine what that child may have been through, especially because of what they put me or my loved ones through.
Yeah, it's just that revolving door, and it's hard to, unless you're in that shoe, to to feel one way or the next. Of course, I'm in a helping profession, but that doesn't mean that can change if something was to happen to you.
Yeah.
I always think probably I'll die from a gunshot, and maybe it will be the very same person that I tried to help. That's just the reality. This can happen. It's very real. It's hard to do. It takes a higher awareness. It takes almost I would even say it's a revelation. It really just taking stock of how life is, and we must come up to that level. Yeah. We must come up to the level of care. While you can have a terrible view of that 14-year-old who did such a thing, collectively, socially, state-wise, we must have a different view. If the state has this view, then dog has eaten our lunch. You have a right to feel how you feel about a certain situation, but the collective think tank can't be equal to that idea. And I think that's where we fail. I mean, you have individuals at all different levels have these views, and just I hope that they're not reflecting the collective thinking of us as a people, because then that's a thing. So I don't know what we could do except to say that education and holding people accountable. And you are entitled to your view and opinion, but the state must have a different view and opinion.
The state must focus on rehabilitation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, how is it, or how do you find then the reaction, or how proactive do you think the state is currently being in addressing these situations?
Which you mean in terms of the social climate,
yes.
the kids, or so?
Or maybe just in terms of the institutions even getting there.
Yeah, let me narrow that down, because
yeah, because that's a huge.
Yeah, it's a huge thing, and only God knows how we'll answer that one. But let me say this. I can just draw some reference to when I was there, because I was there. Let's say institution. I remember the many activities, the calendar of activities we had. And this can be proven or tested or verified.
Yeah.
At the youth hostel, we had an entire program of activities. That program intensified over the weekends. In the summer, the kids that were there, we went on 1 week-long summer camps. Took them all parts of this country. It's exposure. You're trying to keep them busy, your staff and their families. Everybody went. It's like one. So we used to do that. No, I don't know. That still needs to happen. I remember, God rest his soul, and the Palacio, we would call him, and I think he was affiliated with Nietzsche. He said, here, Fermin, we have so many tickets. Every kid at the youth hostel will go to the Festival of the Arts. As a matter of fact, some years later, they participated in the Festival of the Arts. Well, that needs to continue to happen. Engage the population into those activities. They're young persons. They're no different. I still think they go to school and go to high school and transported and all of those things. I say I don't even know how I got into that, but let me tell you, if that is not happening for whatever reason, either there is the finance or the ideas to do it, then we have failed. These kids need to be continuously engaged. What should not be happening is repression, loss of more freedom, and participation. The more you lock up someone, the worse they become internal. I want to think that the flares that we see is because of maybe we need to be, what in what activities are they involved in, including visiting homes. That should be a regular part of the rehabilitation program. No, I'm not saying that that is not happening. I don't even want to say I know what happens.
But you're saying they're essential parts of...
I can just tell you that these kinds of thinking and programs and activities is what makes the difference. It's not the repression and more lockup. So it takes a certain thinking at the institutional level in terms of the workforce to enable some of this. Is this work? You can imagine coming to the Festival of the Arts in the evening or so, or in the day whenever, you know, and busing these people. Of course, there's an expense.
So what do we collectively, as the wider community, perhaps what do we need to focus on? What do we need? Where can we put our efforts? I think there are a lot more people in this society who want to do something to help rather than have the constant criticisms that we hear all the time.
Well, what I used to encourage is participation, community participation. Just about every church from Belmopan down this road, and I was invited to come in. When I say church group, to come and do things with the kids. On weekends, on Sundays, there were services happening, different denominations coming in. There were community persons who would come and pick up these to spend a Sunday with them, and I forgot what we called it. But we had the community involved. They're the ones that have resources and lots of things that can help with engaging these persons. So there was never an end to that. As a matter of fact, the regulation allows for magistrates and certain people, members of the house, to be visitors there. They're laced with a kind of responsibility to go and see what's happening. I don't know when that has. I'm not saying. I can tell you that when I was around, magistrates, judges used to make frequent visits to the youth hostel. Maybe it was a relationship we had, and they would tell you, you know, Fermin, I drop in by, and I remember the late, God rest his soul, as well, Sir George Brown. He was one of the big proponents of community-based stuff. He made it his business to be there regularly, and not in a capacity to find what's wrong, but how can we help support. So there is room, but there must be a climate. You can't be secretive and having like some storehouse, and it needs to be open and transparent. We used to have a board of I forget what you call them, board of trustees or so for the youth hostel that helped the management, helped me that time as a supervisor there. Remember one time I was the physical supervisor at the youth hostel, just being there. That was the norm. The norm was community involvement. People came, got kids, took them home. Were there risks and stuff? Yes, there were risks. Could things have gone wrong? Yes, it could have gone wrong. Fortunately, it never did.
Okay.
So that is what we need, to get involved, open the doors for support, and I think maybe it can help with the rehabilitation, which is an enormous responsibility placed on people there.
That is a great way to close off this conversation as we put this issue into perspective. We appreciate you coming in and having this conversation with us. We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, our focus is going to be on issues in the sugar industry. So please stay tuned.